Hello, and welcome to Poetry at the Dalí. I'm Hank Hine, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this series of poetry hosted by Helen Pruitt Wallace, the Poet Laureate of St. Petersburg. Thank you, City of St. Petersburg, for sponsoring this evening. Tonight we have poets Jeanne Larsen and Lola Haskins. As is our tradition, those poets will be introduced by Helen Pruitt Wallace, but first, Helen will read a poem of her own composition. Helen, welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Hank, and good evening. Welcome to the Dalí Poetry Series. We are so happy that you've found us on YouTube, where we'll be for the foreseeable future, always the second Thursday of each month from 6 until 7:30. Thanks so much for being here to hear these terrific poets. Tonight we have Jeanne Larsen and Lola Haskins. We're thrilled to have you guys here. It seems like it's been a long time coming with a lot in between. We're delighted that you can be here. Those of you who are watching, if you haven't already, please go to tombolo.com and order Jeanne and Lola's new collections and their previous collections. From Alsace, Valentine. It's a wonderful independent bookstore. And they'll be reading, I think, from probably several of their books, but you'd be able to get any of these through Tombolo Books. And they also have terrific events. They are very supportive of the literary community here in St. Pete. And I think you'll really enjoy them if you find them online. Also, I want to thank the Dalí Museum and their staff for the hard work they do in supporting all the arts, and especially for helping us celebrate poetry through this program. It takes a lot of work, a lot of effort, especially during these times. So thank you to all the staff of the Dalí Museum. Hank Hine's protocol, I'm going to start us out by reading one of my own poems, and then I'll turn it over to Jeanne and Lola. This is called Unknowing, End of Summer. The hummingbirds fled, their feeders hanging like half vials of rich blood. And maples shudder their letting go, both from and toward a buried seed. Each morning at my door, a new gray box. I open it. A requiem spills out, too vast to name. Persistent as a phantom limb, heavy like the smell of rain. But sometimes that piercing blue, I take it as a gift, wash the feeders, rake the yard, missing what is and isn't gone, as if I knew them. Uncertainty still hovers midair, the light, the weight on each bare branch. I'd like to start now by introducing Jeanne Larsen. Jeanne's guilty pleasure is Homer's Odyssey. Her latest book, What Penelope Chooses, Poems from 2019, won the Snyder Press Review Book Award. And her other books are Why We Make Gardens and James Cook in Search of Terra Incognita, an AWP Awards Series winner. Those are terrific awards. She also has published 2 collections of translated poems by medieval Chinese women. And I've just learned we're going to get to hear a couple of those poems tonight. I'm thrilled to hear that. And 4 novels, as well as essays and short fiction. Jeanne, you've been very busy. She was the inaugural Jackson Professor of Creative Writing at Hollins University in Roanoke, Virginia. And she has family roots in Florida and grew up as an Army brat in many places. Welcome, Jeanne. So glad you're here.
Well, thank you, Helen. I got to begin by thanking all the people at the Dalí Museum who've done a lot of work to make this happen. And particularly to you, Helen, because you did so much with scheduling and rescheduling, and you are a force. I also would love to talk about hummingbird feeders now after that beautiful poem, but I'm going to resist. I would like to share, because Lola and I just have a common interest in the truly amazing poetry of particularly of China's golden age, the Tang Dynasty. So I have my second book of translations includes poems by one of the rock stars of that period, a woman named Qiang Guanghua. And these are two from a series of poems where she went out with the empress, whose sort of attendant she was. They got away from the crazy life in the palace complex and went out in the hills and had a sort of elegant picnic. And she cranked out this, Qiang Guanghua cranked out this amazing series of poems. And maybe it's a good time for us all to think about how poetry can take us away from the hurly-burly. So the first is number 19 in the series. Free for a while to wander where hills give what they give and water's wisdom runs. At ease, you get a pine tree's outlook. Feel moon trees' heady spice. Here's word for all who would escape the world. No need to quest for paradise away beyond the sea. And then two poems later, because I know there are a lot of poets in the audience, here she is being a little sassier, I think. Beside this pond, I think I'll test my pen, lean on this rock and swept up, write a poem. I'm ready to play a song of creeks and hills, but no, it's better to be one who hears and knows. So poets are grateful for their audiences. The newer book, What Penelope Chooses, is what I like to call my sassy backtalk to Homer, particularly the Odyssey, although I dabble in the Iliad. If I were reading in person, I would ask you all to raise your hand if you've ever pretended that you read Homer but actually hadn't, because a lot of us have been there. Don't panic if you don't know, if you haven't read Homer. I think many of us know the stories. There's a great pop-up book. There's a very good graphic novel that redoes the Odyssey, although I would encourage you to read it, either Emily Wilson's translation, or I'm a big fan of several others. I'm looking to see because I'm nervous. Robert Fagel's translation is really good. However, the important thing when you hear these poems is not to worry about the allusions and so on. You can even ignore my setup, blah, blahs. Don't think, just go into the poetry zone and listen. So the first poem I'm going to read is the last one in the book. And in this one, Penelope is speaking. Penelope the Weaver, that wonderful image of the art maker. And you may know, she famously, we're told 3 times in the Odyssey, which doesn't repeat itself, how she cleverly tricked the bullies who've sort of taken over the house. Odysseus has been gone for almost 20 years. And they say, you got to marry one of us so I can be, whoever you pick becomes the king. And meanwhile, we're going to party. So they are decimating the herds and flocks with all their feasting. Penelope says, well, I can't marry until I have been a good girl and finished weaving a shroud for my father-in-law, who is not well. And every night she sneaks back and unweaves it. You probably know that a lyre, that instrument that suggests the poet, has strings of animal gut. Laertes is her father-in-law. And sometimes I think of that war on Troy, I'm not the only one, as the equivalent of a modern oil war. In some way, it may have had to do with trade routes. All of these poems are sonnets or double sonnets. They're busted, they don't rhyme. I deliberately made the iambics ragged, but I had that form to play with, not something I had done in earlier books. I'm a free verse poet, but it was fun. But I had to sneak in one more line. So everyone, the title is a run-on title. I didn't weave it for Laertes, this whole fractal shroud. Dark wine seas made war roads, cattle butchered, black gold, blood gold, girls enslaved, girls butchered. Daily complicit, Troy too butchered. I held the wordy vagabond off, spun spectral fibers, built my gaudy patterned winding cloth or bridal veil. Each strike of the weaver's rod made an epitaph, betraying pinched identities, words nicked, alterities rebooted. Nights my polyvocal fingers undid, unburied him, drew him near. But soon the weftwork collapsed, love another cascading system, an epic failure. Now, let me tell ya, better gut strings than no thing, better poems, more blind reader and less than mine, all yours. So there the poet tells us something, the poet Penelope. Here, I guess it's someone like me speaking, talking about old man Homer. This poem, like many in this book, is a kind of weaving of voices. So on the page, you can see phrases in brackets. Good luck. I'll try to give you the idea with my voice pitch. You'll recall a lot of traditional biographies. We don't know this so-called person, Homer, but he may well have grown up in what we now call Asia Minor or Turkey, near, just across the Hellespont, that strait, from what's now Greece. That means he may well have passed by the barrow, the huge dirt mound, the tell, that marked the site of ancient Troy, already some centuries gone when we think so-called Homer lived. Homer, could he see it, must have seen how swords can obelisk oiled muscle, how Scamander blood forks to the Hellespont, ships rotting, where touchy heroes lived up to 10 years, held whiz-bang funeral games. Leastways, no passer in his day by could, sighted, miss that barrow, the limestone walls not entirely overcome, huts built from palatial rubble, salt swamp maze of siege-crowded, nerve-jump lower city for centuries drained. Yep, he saw a homing sequel hero, but not bronze, nameless spearmans, nameless wives, spindle whirlers, loving no-name sons as a sea raider loves a wrecked deck's plank. A half-assed history, no images, no justice. He, we, being blind, or might as well. Because one of my interests in this project was all the voices we didn't hear from directly enough that we might imagine. Still, Penelope's important, and you may remember there's a scene when she's worried about her situation and has a dream at night when Athena comes to her. Athena takes the form of Penelope's sister and offers some comfort, not a lot, but says, be of good heart, or Penelope decides to be of good heart, something I think we're all doing a lot of these days. So when I talk about the icon of the simulacrum, here is the goddess Athena, wisdom, her own wisdom, coming to her in disguise. Again, you'll see a reference to the burial shroud that she's weaving and unweaving to hold those suitors off. Athena occurs as a sister, fills her in. Ithaca's queen can decorate the telltale pall with apples, pomegranates done in irony rust, can use brine-blanched fine wool. For fields, the icon says, will be sown with harsher salts. You'll stall the suitors, that simulacrum whispers, but this shows her the barren, full of glib spills, deaths, seductions, circling trash. That textile's shoreline will be unimaginably plundered, oleaginous pandemic stretching upslope, blotching, clogging the Western Isles. Penelope sees the crux, not wire-keen raft, erasure, expanding, thrummed by glory greed. Work of a future snarled, blue-screened, timed out. She tells this to herself, not to the boy. Well, when I run out of things to worry about, I do worry about the climate crisis and overpopulation. But when I was a teenager, like Penelope and Odysseus' son Telemachus, who's very important, especially in the first 4 of the 24 books of the Odyssey, I worried a lot about myself and my parents. And these days I watch my grandson growing up in those ways. So here Telemachus is talking to us, trying to figure out, he can't remember his father. If indeed he is my father, he says once when he's being a little snippy to mom. Again, I see his diminishing, unfamiliar figure on the floor. Again, last night in my dream, my father dies, if he is, that shifty shape Odysseus, my giveaway mama, spins her yarns for. My orders she takes sullen. Telemachus, she calls, it's time. Her strength shrivels mine, but I believe I'm a man, or nearly must be. Time, that boyish beauty wisdom tells me to leave this house. Father and I roam stony corridors, archipelagos, in search of his little wanton duck. Other and subject, has she cracked her upstairs cell, spread and sheathed? Mother, I say, to rule her. He sits on a beach and weeps. Horrific air floods, pallid, erotic singing, crumpled him. So there's the son trying to imagine the father. One more for the climate crisis. You'll recall that both Circe and the prophet Tiresias warn Odysseus, who warns his crew. Now, if we wind up on the island where Helios, the sun god, keeps his cattle, do not eat the cows, no beef. But of course, they blow it and are punished. Shortly afterward, in the course of the story, Odysseus washes up shipwrecked in this kind of fairy tale kingdom of the Phaeacians. In disguise, as he likes to be, he's just a stranger and rough shape. And when the bard of the local court starts telling a story that includes Odysseus, which in fact Odysseus has asked for, he gives himself away by weeping. And the king goes, "Ah, that's who that guy is." The cattle of the sun, what are they? Are they not these torn up roadside deer, the dwindling bighorns, spendthrifted bison, frogs, whales, bees, that withering ice? Odysseus grasps what Circe and Tiresias say, his men devoured. Some journeys later, honored blind Demodocus will lyre sing other winds, not the mine-gouged sea green speck in a galaxy wine dark, spilt, not how we clueless from anoxic algae and tree fern ghosts refine our stinging stinks. A king will see the hoodied traveler's anthropogenic tears, reading past from present. This stranger fought at Troy, clear as clues from birds' flights, skies, hoof boom, superstorm flash. Odysseus, in our tellings, deathless. Sun's disparate cattle aren't. Well, life is short, but art is long, and it sustains us. We have one more from the Sirens, and then I'll finish up. Because we all know the Sirens. There they are, causing trouble. Circe does, right before Odysseus says, "Great year, honey, I gotta go home now," warn him, right after that. She warns him, look out, among other things, for the Sirens. When I use the word Medusae here, it actually refers to jellyfish, okay, glowing at night. But this is a poem for all of us poets because it's ultimately a poem about words and how they give us what we have. Their songs require the man's attention, and the world requires the man, or so he likes to tell the world, himself, us, anyone who'll lend a cloak, a vessel, provision him with sex and information in Circe's way. Beware the sirens, they entangle. They twine so much together. Sanguinary pasts, how present constellates its cloud banks, asters, oblate pebbles, farmsteads, figs, vaporous medusae in noctilucent swarms, wings, birds' slim particularity, their fatness. These notes flock ready to be wrecked, picked clean after the whirlpool pull, the devouring force of pleasures double down. That's what they sing, what Homer sings. Bring it, hear it ring. That's what words do to us. But I gotta give Penelope the last word. So again, remember 3 times we're told about that grave cloth, that shroud she's weaving and unweaving. Displaying, of course, her cleverness. Any poet has to be clever. And one of the questions, I have to read my handwriting, one of the questions in the whole long final arc of the story is, how much does Penelope know what's going on? There's this beggar. Maybe she sees that he's a little bow-legged like her beloved husband 20 years ago. But does she know he's Odysseus in disguise? And I think the scholars have finally decided it's hard to tell. And that's what makes it so beautiful, of course. Homer says Penelope chooses, yet we think the far-seen woman we hear tell of has no choices. We think reiterative Homer speaks it, then a Penelope exists. But is it she exists unscripted and Homer tells it? Is she harp or throat string? Not beta, alpha, pivoting in the furrows when her shuttle turns? Is it hers, the chatty sketch scratch? Think. Without the thrice-told filmy grave cloth, without her trigger finger call for the whole shooting match, said saying's tropolicious web can't turn to a return. Our fabricated Homer, long gone or would be, we discuss her indeterminate form, self-hushing and the bandy-legged saga huckster she imagines back, resists. Of nondescript describer, you know, we know, nada. Know then what Penelope chooses, Homer says. Okay, thanks.
Jeanne, that was wonderful. Thank you for that terrific reading. And I look forward to hearing a little bit more about your process when we get into the questions. That was terrific. So many wonderful images and that rich language that just brought all of them back, brought them to life. So thank you for that. Next, we have Lola Haskins. Asylum and Improvisations on John Clare, published by University of Pittsburgh Press in 2019, is Lola Haskins' 13th poetry collection. Her prose works include Not Feathers Yet, a poetry advice book, and a nonfiction book, 15 Florida Cemeteries, Strange Tales Unearthed. Past awards include the Iowa Poetry Prize, 2 NEAs, 2 Florida Book Awards, the Florida Eden Prize for Environmental Writing, and the Emily Dickinson Prize from the Poetry Society of America. She serves as the honorary chancellor of the Florida State Poets Association. Welcome, Lola. So glad you could join us tonight.
Thank
Lola's
you.
been here before. So.
I have. I've been looking forward to coming back too. Thank you very much, Helen, for being so good to us. And thank you for that knockout reading, Jeanne. And thank you for the Dalí. I really appreciate that the Dalí does these things. And hooray for the bookstore. And thank you for everybody who might be watching now. So I'm not going to go into the John Clare aspect of this book at great lengths because it's basically what I am doing is doing a journey parallel to his, which if you see the book, you'll see why that works. And the sections were so different from each other that I didn't think I could possibly put them together until I realized it's a lunatic journey and I'm making it. So I'm going to read a little bit from each section. The first one, we begin with the beginning, which is death. Mortality. Every thrown stone falls, but there is a moment first, as it hangs in the air, that the blurred hand that tossed it will not come again, thinks the stone as it flies. Next one is a true story. It's about my father. I can't do it, said the coroner. I knew this man, which was how my father came to lie on the cold steel table that night, with no one to probe his nakedness for the gap through which his life had billowed like a curtain, and then, like the scrim it was, disappeared. Down the hall, a bell rings. We hear it everywhere. This next one is called Serenade, and it's a serenade to a tree. Soon your small yellow leaves will become meteors, falling through the dark as all of us must fall, no matter how hard we love, no matter how close we come to writing a line the angels would recite. If only there were such a perfect line. If only there were angels. And the last one I'm going to do from this section is the last, no, it's not, next to the last poem in it. It has to do with when we live in a city, we tend not to do the things that are available in the city because they're always there. When we're alive, we tend not to live because we forget, because it's always there. So this poem is called When You Live Under the Mountain. When you live under the mountain, you do not see the mountain. What mountain, you ask, stirring your tea? As your visitor falls silent before the clouds. The next section here is about the natural world. And I'm going to start with this thing that came from a lot of times I've been in Utah. I was supposed to be Poet Laureate at Zion the second time. Last year, this year, next year, and it's all been put off. So someday I will again. But I was being driven once by the head of the Arts Council across the state. He said, you know, people move here because they found it so beautiful and they want to write about it or they want to paint it, but they find out they can't. So this is called The Interpreters. Only those as shallow as creek stones in drought. As creeks in drought. Only those as shallow as creeks in drought misunderstand our helplessness before languages that meet the throat. The rest of us know that cliffs and clouds can be addressed only in their own terms. There is a school for that is a long train ride off, and from birth, some of us have wanted to study there. But when our applications come back with blank pages inside, we don't know what to do. So we look for signs, the toe mark of a hawk's wing as she lands on grass, the directions a dying wave is fingered on the sand. We would be completely distressed were it not that once in a while one of our tongue-tied number vanishes and comes back glorious, fluent in storm cloud or sage or boiling lava. A child's aptitude for language may surface early, as his mother sees smoke curling from his mouth when she points to the sky, or red rock appearing in his hands when she says canyon. Wanting to keep him close, she will not tell him about the school. Will not matter. He will find it. Perhaps there are teachers among us. There's a man I've been following for miles that walks the narrow path as if he had no feet. I think by that, and by the way his hair brightens on his neck, he may know. I hurry my pace to see if it was he that was singing overhead, but he must have been speaking sky, because when I turn the corner, I see a cloud rising from the stone, rimmed with an eloquence I have seen only in dreams. This next little one is about, I'm attracted to barren landscapes, let me put it that way. In the stark lands, there are no trees to slow the wind. Creatures underground come out only with the stars. There is no other light. The distance to the horizon is a fierce happiness. This is a portrait of my heart. I spent 3 days in Miami in a hotel, which was a residency thing. Actually, it was 2 nights and 1 day, now that I think, no, 2 days and 1 night. And they put, it wasn't a hotel room. It was basically a room for writers. It had a bookcase and it was very narrow and the bed was uncomfortable. It had no view. It was great. And they put a cup with pencils in it on the desk. And I thought, there is no way. I don't write on command. I can't use prompts. I'm terrible at this stuff. I can't do it. And then the pencils kind of said something to me. So I wrote these 2 small poems. This first one is called Turquoise. The sky loved a bay so much that he melted into her. Beside such devotion, we, with all our pride, are less than ants. And the other one is called Ocean Drive, Miami. The hotel fronts pretend to be cake. Look out, Los Niños are banging their spoons on the table. And they're going to get their comeuppance because they're pretty stuck up, those hotels. And I'm going to do a few very small ones. They're called music boxes, and they're not a form. You might think they are, they're not. So the first one is called Luckily Beauty. An eagle crosses high over my head and vanishes into the dappled light. No cry, no wing beat. Yet I looked up. Next one is called Kindness. A sweet gum reaches out from its roots on the hill to touch my window when it rains. Next one's called Fickle. The leaves cling to each other in their drifts. The wind has abandoned them all. Loss. Across the lake, the leafless trees have turned to smoke. I have to say something quick about this next one because it's true. After a hurricane, I went kayaking off Cedar Key, and this was true. I found this. The poem is called Post-Traumatic. A printer half buried in the sand, intact, but mute forever. The final one to do of these is called Perseids. An eyebrow of light trailing a red cloud hisses out in the dark sky water, on which still float 1,000,000 stars. Okay. we're moving on, and I think I'm going to read this next one. I don't usually, I read sometimes because doing everything in memory, it changes the way you do it to some extent. And so I want to read every once in a while. And so this is going to be read. And this section is where John Clare and I get lost, and we keep passing the same things over and over. And some of it's surreal stuff, some of it is humorous stuff. I hope it's humorous. There are all kinds of things in here, but they're all off the wall. So this one is called Saint Francoise de Queison. When Francoise was small, she would run her index finger across the mound of butter that sat like a pretty hill on the plane of its wire shelf, finish with the tip, then suck at what remained under her nail. As she grew, she put aside such childish assaults on the larder and began instead to smear her bread heavily back and forth until she got bored, after which she'd lick her knife to a shine. In this way, years passed, years in which she acquired breasts and long hair black as poppy seed. Then, on the morning of her 18th birthday, she went into the kitchen with no more thought than wondering whether there were hard rolls for breakfast or they'd eaten them all for dinner. And there, kneeling before her, was a long-haired figure in a chef's cap. When she saw the shaft of light falling from her non-existent window onto his faint blonde mustache, she knew he had come from God. "Mademoiselle," said the apparition, and Francoise's mouth began immediately to water. "Oui," seeped from her shiny lips. "You love the butter, mademoiselle, n'est-ce pas?" And again, though she knew that to love butter too much was a sin, "Oui," escaped Francoise. "And the bread?" it said from beneath the mustache. "Oui." By now, Francoise was shivering. "Eh bien," said the angel, whose hands were white, not because he was a northern angel, though he was, nor because a miraculous light was shining on him, which of course it was, but because of the flower. And then he beckoned to Francoise, who had taken a shaky step toward the door. "Venez ici," he said, and produced a plump ball of dough from the pocket of his robe. A male and godly heat came from his direction. Francoise fainted. When she woke, her visitor was gone, and in his place, she found 12 crescent moons aglow in the black sky. I was going to do a whole series of those, but I ran out of gas very soon. So this next one is it's called The Fruit Detective. On the table are traces of orange blood. There's also a mark, probably made by some kind of knife. The detective suspects that by now the orange has been sectioned, but there's always hope until you're sure. He takes a sample. Valencia, this year's crop. Dum-da-dum-dum. The detective puts out an APB, someone with a grudge against fruit. He cruises the orchard, but turns up only a few bruised individuals, probably died of falls. A week goes by. There are front-page pictures of the orange. No one has seen it. They try putting up posters around town. Still nothing. The detective gets a call. "Yes," he says, and "Yes, thanks, I'll be right over." This time, they find a peel. It had been brutally torn and tossed in a wastebasket. "Probably never knew what hit it," said the detective, looking sadly at the remains. There is a third killing and a fourth. People are keeping their oranges inside. There is fear about that with oranges off the street, the killers may turn to apples or bananas. The detective needs a breakthrough. He gets it. "If you want to know who killed the oranges," says a muffled voice, "come to the phone booth at the corner of 4th and Market. 20 minutes, it adds. The detective hurries on his coat. When he gets there, the phone is already ringing. It is the egg. "I did it," said the egg, "and I will do it again." The detective is not surprised. No one but the egg could have been so hard-boiled. Yeah, well, uh-huh. I'm going to do ones which are sort of quieter, but I kind of like them. They're all various takes on the word on werewolves. The first one is called, they're short. The first one is called Werewolf. Listen, I know what is a pillow and what's not a pillow. So I'm not taking off a single clo in this room, let alone getting into bed. So give it up. Then there is Wardwolf. In the night-lit hospital, a sister, black and gray hairs sticking through her wimple, clicks in to check on Granny. Check? Well, not exactly. Check. And this is Wartwolf, a little mound of hair on your arm that you stroke while you're thinking. And the last one is called Querwolf, a pest with wings who meets his petite amie at you and they drink your blood through a straw. I know they're silly, but I like words. There are others I didn't read. One's probably not readable. Okay, so the last section. Okay, I'm going to start with this one because we're in the middle of a pandemic. This is about a plague stone that a friend of mine found. And only he and I know where it is because he didn't tell anybody else. It's called Altar. Between Rilston and Cracow, the plague stone lies, tangled in nettle and fern, where once the villagers in the one that had not sickened left sustenance for their neighbors in the other, turnips and potatoes, tobacco and vinegars and woolen mantles, cotton shifts dyed with tea, caps, scarves, trousers, and skirts for those cold with fever, then crept off home to sit by their firesides, from whence, though they found no tokens on their breasts or backs, nor risings under their ears or armpits, they swore they could feel in their chests the coughs that poured from the dying like the blood of Christ. And in the morning, they all saw it. The pale faces of children would rise like mist off the hills, then vanish as if they had never been. Okay, that's the end of my needing of that. Okay, this is about my favorite hike. One of them, I have a lot of them. It's called Across the Tops. Across the tops, our path runs narrow through heather, whose purple sprigs, being September, are laced with brown. A bleak, sacramental wind cleans us for Rilston Cross and the miles that may remain to us under this dark, gray, roiling sky, whose blue patches open and close in a blink. May no step we take go unnoticed. May we mark the whir and complaint of each flushed grouse. And may we glory in the cold forever. For it is the cold of the sea, of grass and heather and birds and sky, and most of all, the blinking light that gleams wild and holy in our eyes. Okay, I'm going to finish where I began with death. This is, everything in that last section is said in my part of England, so this is too. It's called Constellated. When the atoms in my body return to stars, they will not remember this 5 a.m. out my window. Neither the moor asleep on her side, nor, across her darkened hips, the scatters of bright yellow gorse. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful, Lola. Just so great to hear your poems again. I think you've been 2 times to the Dalí, I believe. Am I right about that?
Yeah, this is the second.
Yeah. But wonderful to hear these poems. And we will transition now to our Q&A, and we're doing it a little bit differently. Those of you who typically come to the museum for our programs, unfortunately, we can't take your questions as much as we'd like to right now. But I have asked Lola and Jeanne to please ask each other some questions. And of course, I'll interject here and there and want to start off with a question. Both of those readings were just terrific. And I'm interested, the idea of form came up a couple times. Jeanne, of course, with your poems, your sonnet series, you know, the fact that your book is made up of all of those, what you call busted sonnets, which just works so beautifully. So I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about your use of form and how you see it as sort of busted, and what sort of energy you feel approaching form in that way helps to create for your book. And then also I'm interested, Lola, in yours, because you talked about the music boxes, and you said very carefully that these are not a form. And yet for me, certainly I'm hearing the echoes of haiku. You made some very definite decisions not to use form and to tell us that you're not, but I'm interested in how, if you think, and maybe you don't, but I'm wondering if you feel like form still informed your poems, even though you made the decision not to write them in any traditional forms. So those are kind of two separate questions, but all based on the same exploration and idea. So who wants to start? Jeanne.
Well, I want to start because I want to say how much I enjoyed your reading, Lola. That was amazing. One of the things that we've been emailing lately, and one of the things that I think we found we have in common right away, and it's a pretty good list, is that sense of poetry as being, I think, body-based, right? And we both wish that we could be standing up and in the room, but we're very happy to be here up by Zoom. And I think that is an unalterable fact about poetry, concrete poems notwithstanding, that transcends this really interesting, I won't call it a divide, energy between free verse, which has all sorts of rules and forms, self-generated and constantly shifting, and form, which is hardly rigid, but particularly in our time and some others, becomes a springboard. So as I think I said, I'm a free verse poet, but after some years of torturing MFA students by making them read and write a little iambic pentameter and sonnets, and then I had them do a lot of other forms in a course, because it's good for free verse poets to do that. And I found myself writing these Odyssey poems, not knowing it was going to be a book. And somehow it came to me that I ought to try casting them as a kind of quasi-sonnets. And it was so good for me because sometimes I run on a bit. I don't have that beautiful succinctness we just heard from Lola. And being limited to 14 lines cheating, 15, a couple of 28-line double sonnets was good. I started my early free verse, had a kind of secret anapestic da-da-dum underbeat, which I think is too rollicking. So being pushed more to a kind of iambic was good. Because then a lot of the poems were drafted as free verse, always rhythmic, of course, any of us poets know that. But I had to compress and figure out and reshape and decide, was I going to do pentameter or hexameter lines where I could squeeze one more word in as a kind of homage, since Homer wrote in dactylic hexameter or recited. That is a different rhythm, but with 6 chunks, six measures, if we think in music. So it was good for me to have that. And although I don't use rhyme, the layout of these poems on the page is very much affected by the kind of units, 8 plus 6, 4, 4, 4, 2, whatever, that sonnets have. After I started doing this, I noticed how trendy sonnets are. The US right now is like England in the 1590s. I mean, there's just sonnets everywhere. So somehow, some of us are hungry for it, and other people, thank heaven, wouldn't go near it with a 10-foot pole.
Well, right, and clearly even free verse poems play by their own rules. I mean, they are a kind of form, are they not? I mean, but they make up their own rules as opposed to relying back on traditional rules. So yeah, no, that's really fascinating. I love hearing that. Lola, what are your thoughts on how it may have formed?
Yeah, I have a few things to say here. First of all, to me, poetry and music are synonymous. So that means that I'm always weaving things as if I'm singing them. And that in a way is a form, but I also think I've written two very definite forms in my whole career. Well, I've written others, but done nothing with them. One of them was a nursery rhyme, because I thought that the sing-song nature of a nursery rhyme takes you places that you really did not know you were going. And that one is, I wrote it when I was 20. It says, let's see, 7 old ladies crochet for the boys, 6 old ladies hear thunder, 5 old ladies afraid of the noise, 4 old ladies go under, 1 old lady to pick up the lace, 1 old lady is crying. How cruel to be born with only one face, and to see in the mirror it's dying.
Wow. Wow.
Well, see, I mean, that's, that needed to be like that, because you couldn't, I wasn't aiming at it or anything. It just happened.
Yeah.
And the only other one I've ever done is a ballad. And there was a big foot and mouth. I'm not going to do the whole thing or anything, but there was a big foot and mouth epidemic in England, and in my part of England. And so I like to read history. So I read in the annals of the very sort of little library we have in Skipton, which is a market town, but they have a lot of old stuff. So I found sheep counting rhymes. And so this poem starts out, 1-ery, 2-ery, zickery, zeven, hollowbone, crackabone, 10 or 11, spin, spun, it must be done. So they push them up. The ewes, the wethers, the lambs, the tups, with their yellow dozers like flowers, oh. Ina, Dina, Dinah, Dusk, Catla, Juina, Wina, Wust. With their yellow dozers like flowers, oh, the wethers, the half-grown lambs, the tups, in mountains now with their legs stiff up. There's another set of rhymes that comes in, but it had to be rhymed. You can see that. I mean, there's no doubt about it. It had to be rhymed. And that's when I use forms, is when I feel they're the way to do it. I read a lot of Chinese poetry. I mean, I'm sort of hooked on it, and also Japanese poetry too. And so I like the mindset. I can't, but I feel that the way they're written is they're written, right? We know, in characters, right? And so forth. And I cannot feel that it would be authentic of me to try to do that. That sounds odd, but I think in that way a lot. I mean, I don't know if you noticed, but maybe some of those very small ones are haiku-like, right?
Right.
But none of them is a haiku. I wasn't avoiding haiku. I was doing it the way my music told me to do it.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that's a good point. Can I say something to Jeanne?
Yes, absolutely. Well, this is
Yay.
a good time for you all to ask each other questions. Absolutely.
So Jeanne, I absolutely love the way you use language. I just think it's great. You were never, and I've read other things of yours, and you're the same way in those. They're just not as flippant as you are here. But flippant's good. I like flippant. And so I'll just say quickly, I told you about this, but it struck me as the same thing. I went to see a production of Hamlet at my local theater, which is an equity theater. They're really good. And I heard ahead of time they were wearing modern dress, and I'm sort of rolling my eyes because I knew someone once who wrote this whole thing with Jesus as the head of a motorcycle gang. I mean, I'm just like, oh, come on. But when I got to the play, the modern dress had an incredibly deep effect on the audience, because you don't say, well, this is a period piece, do you? You say, these are our people, this is us. And then you understand that every single word you're hearing. And in fact, I can recite a bunch of speeches from Hamlet. And when they got to the to be and not to be, I was so rapt that I didn't even think about it. I was just there. And that's what you did, Jeanne. That's what you're doing. You're not allowing, I mean, I don't know if that's true or you don't think of it like that maybe, but that's what struck me. is that you're not allowing people to say, well, this is ancient Greece. What's it have to do with me?
Yeah, absolutely. I went to Homer, I think in part because, lots of reasons, but in part because right now we need, let's bust the canon. I'm a person of my generation, and there were things we needed to change and expand, and I treasure that, and my life gets richer the more it happens. But we need to be able to talk to each other. And the Iliad to some extent, but for sure the Odyssey is something that a lot of people, not everybody by any means, have that we can refer to.
It's a common language.
Yeah, and that's important. So that was part of it. Also, art is news that stays news, right? And poetry is news that stays news. I'm thinking what Helen said, I think, in the September Q&A. We have to keep it alive to keep ourselves alive. But I quite agree about not being constrained by form. That would be foolish. I just had an exchange with a younger poet friend who wants to write haiku, and explaining why really she didn't need to do 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables. That's not haiku. That has to do with the Japanese language. And hooray for
That's right. That's right. Yeah, exactly.
So it's make it new, to quote that sort of dreadful human being and wonderful poet, Ezra Pound. Yeah, well, I wanted to ask you about one of your fellow travelers, that sweet man, John Clare, right?
Yes.
And because that was my doorway to Clare. And if I'm in conversation with Homer and Penelope and the gang, how does that work for you with that remarkable mad genius, I guess?
Well, every year when I go to Skipton, I get his collected poems out of the library, and I don't return them until I go back to America, which is months. He was certainly a genius. Mm-hmm. And I relate to the way he thinks myself, because I think relatively similarly. In fact, I have a poem which I really like, actually, which is a tribute to William Blake and John Clare. It's a short one, but that's okay. But when I put the book together, here's what I've done my whole writing life. When I get practiced at something, I stop doing it. I know I have to do that. I know it. And I started writing monologues in historical voices, just lots and lots and lots of them, after I stopped writing about the obvious things that I started writing when I was I've been reading since I was 3, reciting poems since I was like 5. But I started writing seriously probably when I was in my 20s. And I wrote some of the things that one might write if one were that age and had read E. Cummings. For example, E. Cummings is a good way to get into poetry for a lot of people, perfectly legitimate. But then I started writing all these historical monologues, and I realized, my God, I could do that about anything. You can't do that anymore. Mm-hmm. So I didn't know what I was going to do. And I like thinking in certain different languages. So I wrote 44 Ambitions for the Piano, which, because I started studying piano when I was 40, and I was passionate about playing classical music. I used to sing in clubs, but I sang folk and jazz. But I love classical music, and I wanted to play that, only that. And I realized that I couldn't learn it without words. Mm-hmm. So that's basically because my teacher couldn't explain anything except with her hands, which is how she talks, right? Mm-hmm. So I did that, and then I said, you know what? You can't write any more music poems. You got to stop. So I stopped. And I've stopped with every damn thing I've done, and every time I lose my audience. I got to say that I've lost the magazines. I'm being turned down right and left now because of the stuff I'm writing now. The places that just were so reliable, they always took my stuff, and really good places. I was so happy. They just send me forms. Mm-hmm. And that's the way it is. But when I put the book together, anyway, I have these sections which have nothing to do with each other at all. And I'm just thinking, this is nuts. How the hell am I going to do this? And then I read John Clare's diary, which I'd forgotten about when he escaped from the asylum in 1841. The first thing I read, the first sentence, it says, having only myself in my army, I led the way. Mm. oh my God. And then I went, oh, okay, that's me. And then I read the rest of the diary and I found something that went with every section. And it was a genuine journey that I took parallel to his journey. I love his poetry, but there's nothing in the book that refers to his poetry. It's about his journey, his psychological journey. And it was true. I can't tell you how true it was to the way it was perfect. I'm so grateful. And there's a new book called Poems Chiefly from Manuscript. Have you seen it? It's about this big, it's huge. And they found all these poems, and this person wrote, I just reread the story about his life again yesterday. And the poems are just wonderful, some of them. They really are wonderful. And he doesn't sound like other people.
Yeah.
And he read a lot. He knew a lot of the poets of his time, but he doesn't write like anybody else. And that would be the goal. I don't want to sound like somebody else. I don't want to sound like, oh, look, she's channeling somebody. I do channel people for sure, but I want to sort of conceal it.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that is so rich. Yeah, we need those teachers. You made me think about, for all of us poets here, the way poetry is on the, in the Venn diagram overlap zone of music and visual art.
Right, exactly.
And that richness and energy and tension and frustration, but
yeah, no kidding.
Can give us.
But yeah, it's absolutely like that.
Not getting stuck. Thank you for saying that, because I'm done with Homer. Another reason I went to Homer was that I had 3 novels set at various historical periods in China, and they have fake translations, poems, or old storyteller stories and things. My 4th novel is Appalachian Transcendentalism, and which meant I got to do a lot of natural history.
How
but
fun.
I didn't want to stay with China. I needed to go somewhere new. And so I'm so glad you set yourself that task.
Yeah, well, you know what? If you aren't risking.
Yeah.
And you can write clones of your own poems. I know I could name some poets who do that. And you will be much better known than either of us will ever be if you're good at it. But so what? You're not risking your life every time you write something. And that's what I believe in.
Yeah, yeah.
I write awful stuff too. Oh, by the way, so I wrote this pandemic. I wrote 2 pandemic poems. One of them is Elon enjoys advertising that her mask has penises on it. And the second one says, and this is a review of my work over this time, it says, so much bad poetry, come on, vaccine.
That leads me to a question I want to ask both of you. Given these dark times and the pandemic, where do you see your poems going next? You're talking about, Lola, you're talking about once you have gotten into something and you've explored it, you're ready for something new. I'm curious from each of you. Actually, I'm going to start with Jeanne. Jeanne, where do you see your poems going next for your next book? And will it be poetry, or are you switching gears and going back to novel writing, or do you do both at the same time? I'm curious about where you see your next writing days for both of you.
Right. Well, stay tuned, folks. Both things are happening. I tend to be, if I'm working on fiction, I'm doing fiction. If I'm working on poetry, I do poetry. It's not a rule, but that's how it goes. So in fact, right now I'm sneaking up on a novel. I am recycling Homer. So, but in this new genre. And Lola, if you think switching voices is not a smart career move, think about, switching genres. But as you said, who cares?
Oh, no, I totally get that.
We do what we do. It is for the making. How lovely to be published. How lovely to have an audience. But that's not the point. It's when I'm in the zone. So I'm in the zone with a novel that riffs off the Odyssey, but it's 400 years later and on Circe's Island, and exciting things happen. And we're headed to Hades soon. But the poems I was writing before the lockdown, which I think has had a real emotional, of course it had a tremendous emotional effect on us all, but it has hit that creating piece of my life. I was going back to the natural world in some ways. I was two dear friends, a married couple, died about 3 months apart, a year and a half ago, and
Sorry.
their deaths did what the deaths of people we love do.
Yeah.
But it's something I've been writing my way through in ways, in remembering them.
Yeah.
What'll happen next week? We'll see.
Well,
So
you
how about
don't
you,
know.
Lola?
Well, I actually have ended up, I'm doing some things which I might have written before, but mostly I'm not. And what I'm writing, well, I write a lot about the natural world in general. I have a book called How Small Confronting Morning, and that's exactly, specifically about this part of Florida, the woods and the waters. Because my epitaph is in it, that book. Actually, I didn't write it as my epitaph, but it's going to be that. But I have been for some reason, I've just been overcome with the lack of respect we have for other species.
Mm-hmm.
I've just been and also being alone all the time, because I don't have anybody to live with. I live alone. It struck me the big issues started kind of coming in. I have this series which is there's the first one is seeds, because Kabir said if you want earth, fire, and water and all that other stuff, you can't have that without the seeds. So there's the seeds, and then there's 101 Names of the Wind, and the skein of the sea, and prairie, and fire, 5 translations. And they're big poems. I mean, they're not like me at all. They sort of spiral down pages. I mean, they're a couple pages each, maybe 3, but that's a lot for me. I mean, I don't think like that. And they're big issues.
Wow.
They're almost like, I can't explain them. They read almost as if they weren't written recently.
And they will be in your new book, the next book you have coming out?
Well, probably the next book I have coming out is going to be this one called Not Zeros, if I ever get it published, which God knows. Not Zeros, Not Pearls. It's about insects, only about insects.
Oh, wow.
I spent a number of years talking to entomologists and learning everything I could, because I thought how much we absolutely are unaware of what happens in the air around us and the soil under our feet. We have no idea. And so I started learning some things about insects. So.
And right now, with so many insects disappearing, it's scary.
Yeah, no kidding.
It really
Yeah.
is.
So there's something yes, Lola, no, this is not a prompt, but those of you in the audience, think about, if you're all writers, think about some subject that you can get obsessed with. I have read a couple of Lola's insect poems that I found online, and they're wonderful. And of course, the hummingbird poem that Helen read for us.
Yeah.
Having that material and that vocabulary. The Homeric scholars gave me so many great words.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That was one of the most fun things about writing historical monologues, is like humbuzzes. The word humbuzz is such a great word.
Mm-hmm.
I learned a lot of words like that.
Yeah.
Well, I hate to do it because I feel like we could go on for a long time. You two are so delightful and so smart. And but that's what this program is about. It's about words, and we're so thankful that you could be here, and also to all of you who joined us for this program. We thank you so much. We hope that you will go to Tombola Books and support these wonderful poets and many others who Alsace Valentine also is supporting by carrying their writing. Also, next month, we'll be meeting, it's always the second Thursday from 6 to 7:30, so that will be November 12th. Hope you can tune in again. Until then, please stay safe and hang tight to the power of poetry. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.